Tonight, we travel into a world woven of frost and fate, where snow drifts through ruined keeps and the wind carries the scent of steel and lilac. This is a land where men whisper of monsters and monsters whisper of men, where every choice cuts like a blade and every silence hides a story. Beneath its grey skies walks a figure both feared and mourned, a hunter forged not by birth, but by alchemy and pain. This is the tale of the Witcher, of the White Wolf, Geralt of Rivia, whose path winds through blood and prophecy, through love that burns brighter than any fire, and loss that lingers like mist over still water. It is a song of blades and destinies, of creatures born in darkness and hearts that still dare to seek the light. In this journey, we will walk beside him, through snow-choked mountains and quiet villages, across the bridges of memory where fate hums like a distant lyre. We will meet the souls who shaped his story, the sorceress with violet eyes, the child of elder blood, and the ghosts of men who became beasts long before the curse found them. Before we begin, tell me, what games do you usually play before you drift to sleep? Write your answer in the comments below, and if you enjoy these calm tales of myth and memory, don't forget to subscribe. It helps keep these quiet worlds alive. The snow fell in silence that morning, thick and slow, as though the sky itself wished to hide what was being born below. The air was sharp with the scent of iron, and somewhere beyond the fog, a child cried. Not from fear, but from the cold, a sound quickly swallowed by the stone walls of a lonely fortress. Within those walls, voices murmured. Old, patient voices weighed down by the years. They spoke not of comfort, but of survival. This was Kaer Morhen, though few outside its frozen valleys knew the name. To most of the world, it was a myth, a ruin whispered of in taverns where witches were said to be made. To those within, it was home, though it offered little warmth. Its stones were cold, its halls hollow, and its air forever filled with the faint hum of sorrow. But it was here, within these walls, that boys became something else, something the world needed but did not want. The child who would one day be called Geralt was small, pale, and silent. He did not scream as the others did. When the potions burned his veins and the pain twisted his bones, he watched the firelight with distant eyes. Perhaps he had already learned what the others had not, that to survive the trial of the grasses, one must not fight the pain, but listen to it. Let it become a rhythm. Let it teach. The days blurred into one another, measured not by sun or moon, but by endurance. Each boy was stripped of name and comfort. They were taught to wield steel before they learned to speak clearly again. They learned the scent of monsters, the way a heart beats when it is afraid, the whisper of steel through air. And when the body failed, when the mind began to break, the alchemists began their work. They called it transformation. But to those who lived through it, it was a kind of death. The first potion tore through their blood like liquid fire. The second remade the senses, the eyes turning pale gold, the ears sharpened to every flutter of a moth's wing. The third changed the heart, slowing it, hardening it, teaching it to beat not for joy or fear, but for rhythm. Some boys never woke again. Some woke as something else, their minds hollowed, their bodies changed beyond recognition. Geralt did not die, he endured. When it was over, he no longer felt the same. The light seemed sharper, the shadows deeper, the sound of his own heartbeat too loud. He smelled fear before he saw it. He could see warmth in the dark, hear a lie in a whisper. But something else had gone quiet inside him, the soft, human ache of childhood. It was not gone, only buried deep under the weight of potions and discipline. Vesemir, the old master of Kaer Morhen, watched the boy as he recovered. His eyes were tired but not unkind. He had seen too many boys burn away and too few rise again. He said nothing, only handed Geralt a wooden sword. The boy took it without a word. His small hands were steady. Vesemir nodded once. "Then you'll live," he said quietly. "Now learn to make it mean something." Outside, the snow thickened. The keep's towers vanished into the grey sky, and the wolves began to howl in the forests below. Their voices echoed through the mountains, long, mournful songs that sounded almost like names. The boys who had survived the trials listened in silence. Some trembled. Geralt did not. He only looked toward the sound, his golden eyes catching the light of the fire. It was said that the witches took their strength from wolves, not because they were wild, but because they endured the cold. They did not fight the winter. They became part of it. And so, as the boy grew, he learned to walk as the wolves did, quiet, watchful, patient. He learned to swing his sword with balance, to brew potions that burned through the blood like ghosts of power. He learned to track by scent, to hear the hum of creatures hidden beneath the earth. He learned the signs, small, swift gestures that bent the world just enough to survive. Years passed, though time meant little inside the fortress. The world outside changed, kingdoms rose and fell, kings made war and peace, and peasants whispered prayers against the dark. But in Kaer Morhen, the training never stopped. Boys came, fewer each year, many never left. The world called witches unnatural, cursed, soulless. Yet when the monsters came, it was always their doors that men knocked upon. Geralt listened when Vesemir told him this. "You'll be hated for what you are," the old man said. "Feared, but you'll still be needed." That's the burden of those who survive. Geralt nodded, though he did not yet understand. He would in time. When the last snow of that winter melted, he stood alone on the ramparts, the wind brushing against his white hair. He had no memories of a home before Kaer Morhen. No family, no village, no name but the one the witches gave him, Geralt of Rivia, though he had never seen Rivia. It was a name chosen for him, a story written before his own had begun. He looked down at his hands, the hands of a child no longer, but not yet those of a man. The faint scars along his wrists glimmered in the cold light. Somewhere deep inside, beneath the layers of potions and training, something small and quiet stirred, a thought, a longing, a whisper of what he had lost to become what he was. But the wind carried it away. Kaer Morhen slept behind him, its windows glowing faintly in the dusk. The wolves howled again, closer this time, their voices blending with the breath of the mountain. Geralt turned toward the sound. He did not smile. He did not cry. He simply listened, and in that moment, the world seemed to know his name. The winter was long that year, even by Kaer Morhen standards. The snows lingered far into spring, and when the sun finally broke through, it did so shyly, as though afraid of what the world beneath it had become. Geralt stood at the edge of the courtyard, the wind catching the hem of his cloak. The air carried the scent of thawing pine, wet stone, and distant fire. For the first time in years, the gates of the fortress creaked open. He was no longer a boy. The mutagens had carved away the last traces of youth, leaving behind something lean and quiet, a figure of steel and pale flesh. The witches called it graduation, though the ceremony was little more than a nod and a single, worn sword pressed into his hands. The blade was not new, no witch's was. It had been reforged from older steel, carrying with it the weight of those who had wielded it before. Vesemir watched from the stairs, his arms folded, his expression unreadable. "The world beyond the keep is not kind," he said, "but neither are you. That's what they fear. It's also what will save them." Geralt nodded once, though he said nothing. He had learned by now that words were fragile things, useful only when sharpened by silence. He strapped his sword to his back, adjusted the leather strap across his shoulder, and began the descent from Kaer Morhen into the valley below. The mountains stretched endlessly around him, their peaks white and ancient. The air was thin, and every breath felt like pulling in glass. He followed the old stone path, half buried under years of snow. Wolves followed him from a distance, their eyes catching the light like embers. They did not growl. They only watched, their silent kinship echoing in the rhythm of his steps. Days passed. The world grew wider with every horizon. Forests opened before him like green cathedrals, rivers cut through the land like veins of silver. He saw his reflection in their waters once, golden eyes and white hair staring back at him. And for a moment, He did not recognize the man who looked back. The river seemed to ripple differently around his face, as though unsure whether it reflected a human or something else. He came upon a village at dusk, a small cluster of thatched roofs and smoke. The people stopped what they were doing the moment he stepped into the square. Their eyes darted to the medallion at his throat, the wolf's head gleaming faintly in the firelight. A child pointed. A woman whispered a prayer. A man tightened his grip on a pitchfork. Geralt had been warned about this, but hearing fear in another's breath was different from being told of it. He kept his hood low, his tone even. "I'm looking for work," he said. "Monsters, dead ones preferred." No one answered at first. Then an old man stepped forward, his hands trembling as he held out a crude pouch. Inside was a coin, dull and heavy. "The swamps," the man muttered. "Something takes the cattle. Sometimes it takes the men." Geralt nodded, took the pouch, and turned away. Behind him, the whispers began again, mutant, cursed, unnatural. The words slid off him like snow against stone. He had no anger left for them, only purpose. The swamps were thick with fog that night. The ground sank beneath his boots, and the air reeked of rot and old blood. Somewhere in the distance, a creature moaned, low, drawn out, almost human. Geralt drew his sword slowly, the steel whispering as it left its sheath. The sound felt like part of him, a voice he trusted more than his own. He moved carefully, his senses sharp. The medallion at his neck began to tremble. Magic, not the kind that came from men. Older, wilder. The water rippled near his feet, and from the mist rose a shape, a corpse twisted by hunger and decay. Its eyes glowed with a dull, sickly light. A drowner. It lunged. Geralt stepped aside, the motion fluid, practiced. The sword flashed once, and the creature fell, its body sinking back into the mire. Another followed, and another. The air filled with snarls and the hiss of steel meeting flesh. When silence finally returned, it was heavy, absolute. He wiped the blade clean against his sleeve, sheathed it, and looked up at the pale sky. The stars were faint, smothered by mist. For a moment he stood there, not triumphant, not relieved, only still. It was work, necessary, unglamorous, and endless. When he returned to the village, no one thanked him. The bodies of the drowned had been found, dragged to the edge of the swamp. The people looked at him as though he were one of them, something unnatural pulled from the same mire. He took his coin, said nothing, and walked on. This would become the rhythm of his life, the quiet road, the watchful eyes, the smell of blood and steel. He learned to move between towns like a ghost, never staying longer than needed. The world feared him because it did not understand him. And perhaps in time, he began not to understand it either. There were nights when he would camp by the fire, the warmth flickering across his pale face. The wolves howled in the distance, their cries echoing through the valley. He would listen, the way he had as a child, and feel something stirring inside him, not sorrow, not peace, but something between. He would dream then, though witches were not supposed to dream. The dreams came as fragments, faces he could not name, voices he could almost remember. A woman's laugh, the sound of a child running through snow, a blade reflecting sunlight through the trees. They were not memories, but they felt like things he had lost. He woke before dawn, the dreams fading with the smoke. The fire had gone out, but the ground was warm beneath him. He rose, checked his sword, and began to walk again. There was no path to follow, only the next hunt, the next whisper of coin and need. Somewhere far away, kingdoms moved and kings plotted, but such things did not reach him. His world was smaller, simpler, a dance between man and monster, light and shadow. And in that dance, he found something like peace. The wolves followed him still, silent and unseen, their eyes gleaming in the trees. The wind carried the faint scent of winter, though the summer had barely begun. Geralt glanced toward the horizon. The road stretched endlessly ahead. He pulled his hood tighter, adjusted the blade on his back, and kept walking, a lone figure in the mist, leaving no tracks behind. The world did not remember his name. But somewhere in its quiet heart, the wind whispered it still, Geralt, the white wolf. And though he did not know it yet, his path, carved in snow and steel, had only just begun. Kaer Morhen stood high among the mountains, a relic carved from frost and memory. Its towers had long since begun to crumble, the banners that once hung from its walls now nothing more than faded threads caught in the wind. It was a fortress meant for soldiers, but it had become a tomb for silence. The world below had forgotten it, and perhaps that was mercy. When Geralt returned for the first time after years on the path, the snow greeted him like an old friend. The gates were half buried beneath it, and the great doors groaned in protest as he pushed them open. Inside, the courtyard lay empty, save for a few footprints that the wind had not yet claimed. The training dummies leaned, their straw faces worn to hollow grins, and the air smelled faintly of iron and wolf fur. Kaer Morhen had not changed, but Geralt had. He moved through the corridors slowly, his hand brushing the walls as though tracing a memory. Every stone here had been marked by his youth, every echo was a voice he had once known. Lambert's laughter in the mess hall, Eskel's muttered curses during sword drills, Vesemir's calm instruction cutting through the winter air. They were not here now. Not yet. The keep, for the moment, belonged only to ghosts. In the great hall, the fire pit still burned faintly, a stubborn ember refusing to die. Geralt knelt beside it, feeding it a few splinters of wood until the flame rose again. It cast long, trembling shadows across the walls, shadows that seemed to move like memories of men long gone. He sat there for a while, his sword laid across his knees, the silence pressing around him. Outside, the wolves began to howl. Their song echoed against the mountains, rising and falling like a hymn. Geralt closed his eyes and listened. Once that sound had frightened him. Now it was home. He had returned to Kaer Morhen many times since his youth, but each visit felt different. Each year the fortress grew quieter, its halls emptier. Witches were fewer now. The boys no longer came. The world had changed. Kings waged wars not against monsters, but against each other. Villagers no longer whispered prayers for protection, they whispered about extinction. The monsters had not vanished, but their numbers dwindled, and so did those who hunted them. Vesemir was the last to keep the old routines. Geralt found him near the library, polishing a sword that had not been used in years. The old man looked up, a small smile hidden beneath his beard. "Back again," he said, his voice carrying that familiar mix of weariness and affection. "I wondered when the path would let you rest." Geralt said nothing, only nodded. He placed his gloves on the table and poured 2 cups of what passed for wine. The silence between them was not awkward. It was the kind built through decades of understanding. 2 men who no longer needed words to remember what had been lost. Vesemir finally spoke. "You've seen it, haven't you? The way the world forgets us." Geralt looked into the fire. "I've seen people build temples to new gods and burn books about the old. They don't want to remember." The old man chuckled softly. "And yet they still call when something crawls from the dark. They curse us, then beg us." Geralt nodded again. "It's the way of things." The fire cracked softly between them. For a long time neither spoke. The snow fell outside, painting the windows in white. "You ever think," Vesemir said after a while, "that maybe this is how it's supposed to end, not with a war but a forgetting?" Geralt did not answer. He had no answer to give. Later that night, he walked through the old armory. The racks stood empty. The steel had long been sold or melted. On one wall, carved deep into the stone, were the names of those who had not survived the trials. Dozens of names. Some he remembered. Most he did not. He traced one with his finger, the letters almost worn smooth. "They died so we could live," Vesemir had told him once. But living means carrying what they couldn't. He felt the truth of that now more than ever. In the courtyard, the wind had cleared some of the snow. The training grounds were visible again, the wooden posts, the sword scars etched deep into the wood. He took up one of the old practice blades and began to move through the forms. Slow at first, then faster. Each strike was a memory, each motion a ghost reborn for an instant. The steel cut the air with a sound that was half a whisper, half a sigh. And in that rhythm, he found the quiet that had always lived inside him. It was said that witches were emotionless, stripped of feeling by alchemy and mutation. But it was not true. They felt, only deeper, slower, and alone. Their emotions were not gone. They were buried, like the roots of the mountains. As the night deepened, the others began to return. Lambert first, his voice sharp and restless as ever, breaking the silence like lightning through fog. Then Eskel, calm and tired, his face marked by new scars. They greeted each other with few words. Their bond did not need them. The great hall filled again with firelight and the faint hum of conversation. For a night, Kaer Morhen lived. They drank, laughed, argued, the same rituals repeated, perhaps to remind themselves that they were still human or something near it. At one point, Lambert lifted his mug and said, half in jest, to the dying breed. No one laughed. They drank all the same. Later, when the fires burned low and the others had gone to rest, Geralt remained by the flames. The wind howled softly outside, carrying with it the scent of snow and pine. He looked toward the great doors, half expecting to see another boy walk through them, frightened and trembling, eyes not yet gold. But none would come. Not anymore. He closed his eyes, and in the crackle of the fire, he heard the voices of the past. The laughter of his brothers, the calm tone of Vesemir, the cry of the wolves outside. All part of the same song now, the one that Kaer Morhen had always sung. Of endurance, of silence, of memory that would outlast the men who carried it. Geralt rose and threw another log onto the fire. The flames flared, warm and gold. For a moment, it almost felt like the world outside had never changed. But it had. And he knew when dawn came, he would leave again. He always did. The sun rose pale and distant over Kaer Morhen, spilling weak light across its towers. The frost on the ramparts glistened like a thin layer of glass, unbroken and still. Within the keep, smoke curled lazily from the chimneys, carrying with it the smell of old wood and iron. For the first time in months, laughter stirred faintly through the hall, low, worn laughter, born from habit rather than joy. Geralt sat by the long table, sharpening his sword. The steady rasp of the whetstone echoed in rhythm with the crackling fire. Across from him, Lambert muttered under his breath, his boots up on the bench, eyes half-lidded with fatigue. Eskel stood near the window, staring into the snow, the faint scar on his cheek catching the morning light. Vesemir moved quietly among them, as he always had, his presence less a command and more a comfort. The old wolf carried a heaviness that none dared to name. Kaer Morhen had weathered centuries, wars, winters, betrayals, yet it could not withstand time's simplest cruelty, being forgotten. There were fewer witches every year, fewer boys to train, fewer potions to brew. The walls that had once echoed with the clash of swords and the shouts of students now knew only silence. Lambert sighed. Every winter it feels quieter, he said, tossing his whetstone onto the table. One day I'll come back, and this place will just be gone. It will outlast us, Vesemir said softly. Lambert smirked. Though his eyes betrayed the truth, he didn't believe it. None of them did. Later that morning, Geralt walked the battlements alone. The cold bit at his face, but he didn't mind. Below him, the valley stretched for miles, the trees heavy with frost. The silence here was not empty. It was alive, filled with memory, with the quiet breath of those who had walked these stones before. Every gust of wind carried their voices. Every howl of the wolves was a song for the ones who never left. He paused at the edge of the rampart, looking toward the mountain road. It vanished into the mist far below, the same path he had walked as a child, trembling and small. It seemed narrower now, as if the world itself were closing in. He wondered how many had followed it after him, how many would ever again. The world had grown strange since his youth. Men no longer feared monsters as they once had, they feared each other more. War had devoured the north, and kingdoms burned for crowns that meant nothing. The coin still flowed for witches, but the respect, the quiet acknowledgement of necessity, was gone. They were relics now, hunters of an age that refused to die quietly. As he turned to go, something caught his eye, a small shape in the snow near the courtyard gate. He descended the stairs quickly, the frost crunching beneath his boots. It was a bird. Small, grey, wings stiff and frozen. It must have fallen from the cliffs above. Geralt knelt beside it, brushing away the snow. Its feathers were thin, its eyes closed. He could feel no heartbeat, but even so, he found himself holding it gently in his gloved hand, as though afraid to disturb what peace it had found. He stood there a long while, the dead bird in his palm, the cold pressing against him like water. Then he set it down upon the wall and covered it with a small pile of snow. When he looked up again, the wind had changed. The mountains moaned softly, the trees swaying in slow rhythm. He thought, for a fleeting moment, that he heard the faint cry of something old. Not sorrow, not warning, just a reminder. Even here, in the heart of silence, life still turned. By evening, the others were gathered again in the hall. The fire burned low, and the room glowed with the soft gold of dying light. Vesemir stood at the head of the table, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked at them, his sons, though none shared his blood, and sighed. There was a time, he said, when Kaer Morhen was full. Laughter in the halls, steel on stone, boys shouting from the yard. We thought it would always be that way. Lambert shifted, frowning. And now, Vesemir's gaze drifted to the fire. Now it's ours to remember, that's enough. Silence settled again. Geralt looked around the hall, at the walls blackened by smoke, the scars on the tables where swords had once struck too deep, the faded wolf medallions carved into the pillars. Each mark told a story. He wondered if anyone would remember them when the keep finally fell. That night, snow fell heavier than it had in years. The wind howled through the gaps in the stone, shaking the shutters like a beast scratching to get in. The fire hissed and spat, its flames bending low. Geralt sat awake long after the others had gone to bed. He could not sleep, he rarely could when he returned here. The silence was too heavy. It carried too much of what was gone. He wandered the corridors, the torchlight flickering across the walls. He passed the alchemy room, its shelves still lined with vials of dust and glass, their labels faded beyond reading. He passed the library, where the old tomes still rested open, as if waiting for hands that would never turn their pages again. Every room was both familiar and foreign, the same as it had been, and yet emptier for it. When he reached the main gates, he stopped. The snow had sealed them halfway shut again. He could see his breath curling into the dark, vanishing before it reached the air. He thought of the world beyond, the villages, the roads, the faces of strangers who whispered his name as if it were both curse and blessing. He thought of the path that waited and the silence that would follow. Kaer Morhen will outlast us, Vesemir had said. Perhaps it would, but not as stone. Not as walls. It would live in memory, in the blood of the few who still carried its lessons, in the ghosts of the mountains that whispered to the wind. Geralt turned back toward the hall, his shadow stretching long across the snow. He paused at the entrance, looking once more at the flicker of firelight within. For a brief moment, he saw them, the younger faces of those he had trained beside, laughing, shouting, alive. He blinked and they were gone. He exhaled slowly, his breath fading into mist. Kaer Morhen was not dying. It was dreaming. Every stone that crumbled, every flame that dimmed, every echo that faded was part of that long sleep, a rest earned after centuries of endurance. And so Geralt, the White Wolf, stayed one last night. He sat by the fire until dawn came pale and grey over the mountains. Then he rose, gathered his things, and stepped through the gates once more. Behind him, the fortress stood silent against the morning light. The snow fell softly, filling his footprints before he reached the path below. Kaer Morhen did not watch him go. It did not need to, it remembered. The path was never a road laid in stone or marked upon any map. It was a living thing, a tangle of trails that wound through forest and marsh, through towns that looked the same and names that never mattered. It had no beginning, no end, and for those who walked it, no promise of return. For witches, the path was life itself, the long road between one hunt and the next, between silence and the sound of a heartbeat not their own. Geralt had walked it for so many years that time itself had begun to blur. Seasons melted into one another, and faces turned to ghosts before they had names. The mutations that had remade him in childhood now ruled every breath, every instinct, every dream he no longer had. He did not grow sick, nor weak, nor old. His heart beat slow and steady, each pulse precise and measured. His blood moved colder than a man's. His eyes, pale gold in daylight, saw the world in 1,000 shades of night. He was built to survive, but survival, he had learned, was not the same as living. Once, he had believed the mutations were a kind of gift, that the power in his blood was proof of purpose, that to walk unafraid into darkness was a blessing, not a burden. But years on the path had taught him otherwise. The world did not see a guardian when they looked at a witcher. They saw a reminder of something unnatural, something neither man nor monster, a reflection of what men feared most, their own creation. In the towns where he hunted, he was welcomed only by need. A frightened plea, a bag of coin, a muttered curse as he left. Children hid behind doorways when he passed. Priests spat in his shadow. Yet when the night grew long and the howls began, they lit candles and whispered his name in hope. He was their savior and their shame. The mutations had done more than change his body. They had changed his place in the world. He no longer belonged to it. He could feel his distance in every touch, every look that lingered a moment too long before turning away. Even when he stood among men, he felt apart, as though the air itself refused to carry his warmth. Sometimes, when he camped alone by the fire, he would hold a hand close to the flames, feeling the heat. It never hurt him. The fire would lick across his skin, and still he felt only a faint warmth, as though it reached him from another world. That distance was everywhere now, in the laughter of inns, in the smell of food he no longer needed, in the soft beauty of dawns he could no longer feel. The mutations had given him strength, but taken something deeper in return, the easy rhythm of being human. He remembered the first time he noticed it. He was tracking a wyvern in the hills of Sodden, the ground slick with rain. The creature had torn through a caravan, its claw marks deep and precise. Geralt had followed the trail through mud and bone until he found it perched atop a cliff, wings torn and eyes wild with hunger. The fight was brief, steel against scale, muscle against rage. When it was over, the beast lay dying, its breath coming in wet, ragged gasps. He should have finished it quickly. But for a moment, he simply watched it struggle, its eyes meeting his, two predators, both weary, both alone. There was no hatred in its gaze, no malice, only instinct. The same instinct that drove him. He ended it cleanly, and when he stood there, rain falling hard against his face, he realized he felt nothing at all. No triumph, no grief, no satisfaction, just silence. That silence haunted him. Years later, he still felt it, the numbness that came not from apathy, but from exhaustion. Witches did not feel less because they were heartless. They felt less because they had felt too much, for too long. The world demanded their violence, but denied their humanity. Somewhere along the way, something inside them simply stopped trying to reconcile the two. It was Vesemir who had warned him once, long ago. The mutations don't make you less human, Geralt. The work does. He had not believed it then. He did now. There were nights when he could hear his heart slowing, a calm, steady rhythm, unfazed by fear or fatigue. The alchemists had called it perfection. He called it loneliness. The potions they brewed, the same ones that once nearly killed him, had become part of his life. Each vial a weapon, each sip a reminder. They turned his veins to fire, his vision to clarity, his body into something that moved faster than thought. But when the potion faded, when the body calmed, the hollowness returned. The world became heavy again, too sharp in its quiet. Once, he had stood before a mirror after a hunt, wiping the blood from his face. He had caught his reflection in the dim candlelight, the yellow eyes, the thin scar across his cheek, the stillness that came too easily. The eyes of a predator, not a man. And yet, within that reflection, there was something fragile, a faint memory of the boy who had walked into Kaer Morhen, trembling in the cold. He wondered then if that boy had truly died, or if he still lived somewhere deep inside, waiting to be seen again. But the path left no time for wondering. There was always another contract, another creature, another coin purse left on a table. And so he walked, through forests that whispered his name, through villages that turned away their eyes. He listened to the heartbeats of beasts before they lunged, to the trembling breaths of men who hired him. He learned to live between moments, to exist in the space where life and death blurred together. Sometimes he would hear stories of other witches, those who had tried to leave the path, to settle among men, to build homes and live quietly. None of those stories ended well. The world did not forgive what it could not understand. And so, Geralt remained what he was, a blade for hire, a necessary sin. But there were rare moments, fragile and fleeting, when the wall between what he was and what he had lost seemed thin. A child's laughter in a market square, a song drifting across a tavern courtyard, a stranger's kindness offered without fear. He would stop for a heartbeat, listening, almost believing he could still belong to such a world. Then he would remember the eyes that glowed in the dark, the steel that waited at his hip, and the promise that bound him to the path. The mutations had saved his life, but they had also stolen its meaning. He was stronger than men, faster, more resilient, but he was not free. He was bound to his design, a creation of need, doomed to serve the fear that had birthed him. Yet, for all the pain it brought him, he never wished it undone. The mutations had taken much, but they had also given him purpose, a way to stand in the space between chaos and the innocent. He was not human, perhaps, but he was the reason humanity survived. And in that thought, there was peace, not the warm peace of comfort, but the cold, clear peace of knowing one's place in the world. The path wound onward through the snow and mist. Geralt walked it alone, as he always had. His shadow stretched across the frost, his breath misting in the dim light. Somewhere behind him, the wolves sang their endless song, a sound not of mourning, but of endurance. He did not look back. He did not need to. The path had already claimed him. And in the stillness between heartbeats, he accepted what he had become, not a monster, not a man, but something in between, walking forever through the twilight of both. The fire had burned low. Only the faintest red glow remained beneath the ash, like a heart still beating after death. Geralt sat before it, unmoving, his back resting against a fallen log. The night was deep, one of those moonless nights when the world seemed to hold its breath. The wind had gone quiet. The forest slept. Only the Witcher remained awake, his eyes reflecting the dying embers. The path had brought him here, though he could not recall the name of the village he had left behind or the one that lay ahead. They had all begun to blur together, one endless chain of suffering, of fear and firelight. Another monster slain, another handful of coins pressed into his palm, another silent departure before dawn. It was life, if one could call it that. He reached for the flask at his side and took a slow drink. The taste was bitter, metallic, not wine, but the remnants of a potion. It burned down his throat, filling him with warmth that felt almost human. But only almost. The mutations had made him efficient. They had carved away the weaknesses of flesh and doubt. His eyes could pierce the dark, his reflexes faster than thought, his body a weapon honed by decades of battle. But what they could not grant him was rest. Even when still, the Witcher's blood hummed beneath his skin, too aware, too alive. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, it brought no dreams, or at least it wasn't supposed to. But lately, when exhaustion finally took him, he had begun to see flashes of things that should not have been. a field of snow beneath a grey sky. A child's laughter carried on the wind, the touch of a hand against his cheek, warm, fleeting. A voice calling his name, soft as a prayer. He would wake then, the fire long dead, the world cold again. Witches were not meant to dream. The mutagens had burned that part of them away long ago, and yet he stood and stretched, the leather of his armor creaking softly. Somewhere beyond the trees, a stream whispered against the stones. He followed the sound until he reached the water's edge. The moon had risen now, pale and watchful, its light laying silver across the surface. Geralt knelt and looked into it. At his reflection, the ghost of a man carved from shadow and steel. His eyes, those cursed golden eyes, stared back with the patience of a predator and the sorrow of a soul that remembered what it meant to feel. He splashed the water across his face. It was cold, almost painfully so. The shock brought clarity, and with it, memory. There had been a time, long ago, when he had not been alone by the fire, when another voice had filled the silence, sharp, intelligent, mocking, but gentle in the spaces between words. Yennefer. Her name stirred in him like the first breath after drowning. He had tried to bury it once, to forget, but memory clung tighter than blood. She had been the one to remind him that his heart still beat, not because of alchemy, but in spite of it. She had seen in him something he had long denied, that to feel pain was not a weakness, but proof that he was still human. And though their love had been as fierce and fragile as fire in the wind, it had been real. But love, for witches, was always a kind of wound. It healed and it hurt again. Geralt rose, brushing the water from his hands, and turned back toward the forest. The dreams had begun after their last parting, after she had left him with words too soft to remember clearly and silence too heavy to forget. He had not sought her since. Some distances could not be crossed by roads. The path ahead wound upward into the foothills. The night air thinned, and snow began to fall, soft flakes that melted the instant they touched his armor. The world was quiet again, save for the crunch of his boots against the earth. He liked the silence. It was honest. The noise of men was full of lies and fear, but silence never pretended. Hours passed, or perhaps only moments. Witches were not good at measuring time. Then, in the distance, he heard it, the low growl of something breathing where it should not. He drew his steel sword, its edge catching the faint light of the stars. The scent reached him next, rot and sulfur. The stench of an old curse. The creature came from the shadows with a shriek, a twisted form of man and beast, its claws blackened, its eyes burning with rage. Geralt moved without thought, his body a rhythm older than memory. The sword flashed once, twice. The air filled with sound, metal, breath, blood. When it was over, the creature lay still, and the world was silent once more. He stood over the body, his breath slow, steady. There was no triumph in the kill, only necessity. He cleaned his blade, sheathed it, and knelt. Beneath the creature's mangled face, he could still see the traces of humanity, a scar, a curl of hair, the ghost of a man who might once have been kind. He whispered a quiet prayer, though witches had no gods. It was not for the creature nor for himself. It was for the thin line that separated them and how easily it could vanish. As he walked away, he thought again of the mutations that had made him what he was. They had been designed to remove fear, to silence the trembling of the soul. But fear was not always an enemy. It was the shadow of care, the echo of love, the proof that one could still be broken. Without it, what remained was not peace, it was emptiness. The snow deepened. The cold pressed closer. Geralt stopped and looked at his hand. A thin scar ran along his palm, one of thousands. He flexed his fingers, and for a moment he imagined what it would feel like if another hand had been there to hold it. The thought surprised him. It almost hurt. He smiled faintly, not out of joy but recognition. The mutations had not taken everything. Not yet. Somewhere deep within, beneath the steel and scars, beneath the silence and solitude, something still stirred. Something stubborn and human. It was small, perhaps, but it was enough. He continued on. The snow began to fall harder now, covering his tracks almost as soon as they were made. The wind rose and whispered through the pines. To anyone watching from afar, he would have seemed a ghost, a figure of white and grey fading into the storm. But within that storm, his heart still beat, slow, steady, unyielding. And though the world would never see it, though no song would ever sing of it, that small, defiant rhythm was his truest victory, the proof that even what was made to feel nothing could still remember what it meant to be alive. He walked until the first light of dawn touched the mountains, faint and colorless. The wind calmed, the sky softened, and the world began again. Geralt stopped at the crest of a ridge and looked out across the valley below. Smoke rose from distant chimneys. Somewhere down there, people woke to another day of fear and hope. He watched them for a long while, his eyes unreadable. Then he turned away. The path awaited, always forward, always alone. Fate rarely announces itself. It does not roar like thunder or blaze like fire. It comes softly, a turn of the wind, a word spoken without thought, a promise made in passing. And yet, from such quiet things, entire worlds are shaped. For witches, fate was something best avoided. They lived by coin, by contract, by the cold simplicity of survival. But destiny has a way of finding those who walk alone too long. And for Geralt of Rivia, it began with a law older than kings, a law that bound men not by blood, but by the unseen hand of chance, the law of surprise. He had heard of it before, every witcher had. A custom as strange as it was ancient. "Give me that which you already have, but do not yet know," the law said. A riddle dressed as a debt, meant to seal bargains between men. Most used it lightly, a jest between nobles, a trick among friends. But sometimes the world took it seriously. Sometimes destiny listened. It was in the kingdom of Sintra that it found Geralt. He had come seeking only coin, a beast to slay, a nest to burn, nothing more. The keep was filled with music and warmth, the scent of roasted meat, and the laughter of those who had never faced the wild. Geralt had always felt misplaced in such places. He stood by the wall as nobles danced, his white hair a quiet scar among the gold and color. The king's voice broke through the noise, laughter, then argument, then fear. Geralt turned. A man knelt before the throne, desperate and pale, his clothes torn, his eyes wild. Behind him, a woman wept softly. The man's words tumbled out in panic, a story of a curse, of a daughter transformed, of love found in a beast's shadow. And when he spoke of his promise, of the debt he owed, the hall fell silent. The law of surprise. Geralt understood before the king did. The man had promised the first thing he found upon returning home, and when he did, it had been his newborn child, the child of surprise. The queen's face turned white. "You would give your own blood to a stranger's word," she cried. But it was too late. Words once spoken are seeds in the soil of destiny, and this one had already begun to grow. Geralt stepped forward then, his voice calm. "You owe me nothing," he said to the man. "The law is not meant to steal, it's meant to bind." The man looked up, shaking. "Then take something else, gold, land, anything." Geralt's eyes met his. There was no greed in them, only resignation. "Destiny doesn't care for bargains," he said quietly. "If it has chosen, then the choice is already made," the court murmured. The queen's anger rose, but her fear was stronger. She knew the stories, knew that those touched by surprise were rarely ordinary, and so she ordered him gone, fearing what the law might bring. Geralt bowed once, turned and left without another word. Outside, the night had fallen thick over the city. The streets were empty, the torches burning low. He walked through them without sound, his mind as still as his steps. He had not meant to invoke destiny. He had never wanted its touch. The path was cruel, but it was simple. Fate made it complicated, and yet, even as he told himself it was done, that the law would forget him as easily as he forgot others, he felt something shift inside him, a quiet recognition, like the pull of a tide he could not see. Somewhere in the world a child had been born. Years passed. The path continued, and the law of surprise became little more than a ghost in Geralt's mind. He hunted, he wandered, he endured. But now and then, when he camped beneath the stars, he would feel that same pull, faint but constant. A thread stretched across the world, humming softly whenever he grew too still. He had tried to cut it once in his heart, told himself that destiny was nothing but a story men told to make sense of the chaos. But deep down, he knew better. The law was no man's invention. It was the shape the universe took when it wanted two souls to meet. It happened, as fate often does, without warning. A storm was rolling across the northern plains. The rain fell hard and cold, turning the roads to rivers of mud. Geralt rode through it, his cloak soaked, his horse's breath heavy. The wind howled like a living thing. Somewhere ahead, through the fog, he heard it, a cry, small and sharp, cutting through the storm. He found her by the wreck of a cart, surrounded by splintered wood and broken wheels. The men who had guarded it lay dead, their faces pale beneath the rain. A child crouched beneath the wreckage, clutching a blood-stained doll. Her hair was pale as snow, her eyes wide with fear and something else. Recognition. Geralt dismounted slowly. "It's all right," he said, though his voice carried more steel than comfort. "I won't hurt you." The girl looked at him, trembling. "They said a witcher would come." He froze. The words struck something deep within him, older than memory. He stepped closer, and the medallion at his neck began to hum. The air around her shimmered faintly, not magic, but something older, deeper. "What's your name?" he asked. "Ciri," she whispered. The storm broke overhead, lightning flashing white across the sky. In that brief moment, he saw her clearly, the bloodline of kings, the echo of prophecy, and something in her gaze that felt like the reflection of his own. The law of surprise had found him. He wanted to deny it, to turn away, to pretend it meant nothing. But as he lifted her from the wreckage, feeling her small heartbeat against his chest, he knew the truth. The path he had thought endless had changed its course. The road ahead would no longer belong only to him. As the rain softened and the thunder drifted into distance, he looked down at her, the child of surprise, the promise made long before either of them had known it. Destiny had many faces. That night, it wore the face of a frightened child with ash-blonde hair. He mounted his horse, holding her close, and turned toward the road that led into the mountains. The fire of the storm faded behind them. The wolves began to howl somewhere in the distance, their song echoing through the dark. Geralt did not look back. For the first time in years, he did not feel alone. The fire crackled softly beneath the shelter of the trees. Rain whispered against the leaves above, a quiet rhythm that matched the steady breath of the child sleeping beside him. Ciri lay wrapped in a woolen cloak too large for her, her face turned toward the faint warmth of the flames. Geralt watched her from where he sat, unmoving, his eyes half hidden beneath the shadow of his hood. He had never been meant to keep her. That was not the way of witches. They walked alone, untethered, bound only to coin and the monsters that paid for their survival. Yet the law of surprise had a will of its own, and now the child slept beside him, her small form curled like a secret in the night. He remembered her cry through the storm, the way her eyes had looked into his, not in fear, but in recognition. As though she had seen him before, in dreams perhaps, or in the quiet murmur of destiny. She trusted him instantly. It had frightened him more than any monster ever could. For days, they traveled in silence. Geralt rode at a slow pace, his cloak drawn tight against the wind, while Ciri sat before him on the saddle, her small hands gripping the reins. She spoke little at first, only watching the world pass by, forests fading into hills, rivers twisting through valleys of fog. The child was quiet, but her eyes were always searching, as though trying to remember a world that had already begun to forget her. At night, she asked questions. Not about monsters or magic, but about him. "Why do people call you White Wolf?" he thought for a moment before answering. "Because I have white hair," her brow furrowed. "That's not a very good reason." He almost smiled. "No, but it's the only one they need." Ciri was not satisfied with that. She rarely was. She had a way of asking questions that went deeper than she meant them to, questions that reached into the places he had long stopped looking. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked one evening as the sun fell behind the trees. Geralt didn't answer immediately. He had spent years learning how to live without needing anyone, but as he looked at her, the truth pressed quietly against the back of his throat. "Sometimes," he said, "but the path doesn't leave room for it." She tilted her head. "Then maybe the path is wrong." He didn't reply. But her words stayed with him long after she had fallen asleep. As the days turned to weeks, the bond between them grew, not by design, but by the quiet rhythm of survival. He taught her how to track footprints in the mud, how to tell when the forest was too silent, how to listen for danger before it came. She learned quickly, too quickly. There was something in her that echoed him, not the stillness of a witcher, but the same gravity, the same unspoken weight that drew them both forward. They crossed through lands scarred by war. Villages burned and left to rot, banners torn down, the smell of smoke clinging to everything. Geralt tried to keep her from seeing too much, but Ciri's eyes missed nothing. She would fall quiet for long stretches, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as though she already understood the cruelty of the world far better than she should have. One night, they found refuge in an abandoned chapel. The walls were cracked, and the candles melted into stumps, but the roof held against the wind. Geralt lit a small fire in the corner while Ciri explored, her footsteps soft against the stone floor. She stopped before a faded mural of a goddess, her face half worn by time, her hands raised toward the heavens. "Is that who people pray to?" Ciri asked. "Some of them," Geralt said. "Do you?" He hesitated. "No, why not?" He looked into the fire, the flames flickering in his eyes. "Because prayers are for people who believe someone's listening." Ciri was silent for a moment. Then she said softly, "Maybe someone is." He didn't argue. She was a child after all. But something about her tone, quiet, certain, lingered in his mind. That night he dreamt again. Not of monsters or battles, but of Kaer Morhen. The courtyard covered in snow. The sound of laughter, light, young, alive. He saw her there, training beside him, her sword too big for her hands, her eyes burning with determination. He woke before dawn, the dream still clinging to him like mist. Ciri was awake already, sitting by the fire. She turned when she saw him. "You were talking in your sleep," she said. "What did I say?" "You said my name." Geralt froze. The fire cracked softly between them. He said nothing, and she didn't press. But she smiled faintly, as if she already knew what it meant. As the weeks turned into months, the path began to change. The road that had always felt endless now had meaning, not because it was safer, but because it was shared. Geralt found himself thinking differently. Watching the horizon not for danger, but for beauty. The way the light touched the fields at dusk, the way the stars mirrored themselves in rivers. He had forgotten how to see such things. She reminded him. In her laughter, he heard echoes of the world he had lost. In her questions, he found pieces of the man he had once been. But destiny, ever patient, waited. Their peace was not meant to last. One evening, as they crossed a quiet valley, Geralt felt it, the tremor of something powerful moving in the distance. His medallion began to hum. He slowed his horse, scanning the trees. Ciri noticed it too. "What is it?" she whispered. "Something that's looking for us," he said. Before she could ask more, the wind shifted. A figure emerged from the fog, cloaked, faceless, its presence thick with magic. Geralt drew his sword, placing Ciri behind him. The figure spoke, its voice soft but sharp as glass. "She is not yours, White Wolf. She belongs to destiny." Geralt's grip tightened. "Destiny belongs to no one." The figure tilted its head. "Even you were claimed by it once. You should know how this ends." The ground trembled. Light cracked the air like lightning, and then silence. The figure vanished as if it had never been. Only the echo of its words remained, hanging in the cold. Ciri looked up at him, her eyes wide. What did it mean? He sheathed his sword slowly. "It meant," he said quietly, "that destiny doesn't like to be ignored." They rode in silence for a long time after that, but the air between them had changed. There was a weight now, not of fear, but of knowing. Fate had found them, and this time it would not let go. As night fell, they made camp by the edge of a frozen lake. The stars shimmered faintly above the glassy surface. Geralt sat beside Ciri as she slept, the reflection of the sky dancing in her pale hair. He had spent a lifetime avoiding the touch of destiny. Yet now, as he watched her breathe, he realized it had never been a curse. It had been a path, one that led him not to power or glory, but to something far rarer, purpose. For the first time in years, Geralt of Rivia felt the faint, fragile warmth of peace. He looked up at the stars, and for once, he did not feel alone beneath them. The world had grown colder since the child came into his life, not by the hand of winter, but by the slow, creeping stillness of fate. It was a silence that lingered in the air, carried by the wind that moved through the pines, whispering of things yet to come. Geralt felt it with every step, every breath, the quiet tremor of change, vast and unseen. Ciri had grown since that first storm. The child who once clung to his cloak now rode beside him, her eyes reflecting the silver of dawn. She had learned the rhythm of the road, the weight of the saddle, the patience of silence, the art of seeing what others could not. Her movements carried grace, her stillness a strange kind of wisdom. But beneath it all lay something else, something ancient that the world itself seemed to recognize. The wind often shifted when she passed, bending around her as if in reverence. The trees leaned. The ravens watched. The air shimmered faintly in her wake, and though she never spoke of it, she felt it too, the pulse beneath her skin that was not entirely her own. The blood of the elder flowed in her veins, though she did not yet understand what that meant. It was the oldest song of all, older than kingdoms, older than men, a melody of power woven into her soul before she had ever drawn her first breath. She carried within her not just the memory of worlds, but their potential, creation, destruction, and everything in between. Geralt saw it first not in battle, but in quiet moments, when the snow fell too softly, or when the firelight flickered in unnatural rhythm. Once, by a river at dusk, the water had begun to move before the wind touched it, swirling in gentle spirals as if drawn to her reflection. She had not noticed. He had. And though he said nothing, the truth settled deep in him, unspoken, immutable. The girl was not merely a child of surprise. She was a child of destiny. The path they walked had grown heavier because of it. Shadows followed them where none should have been. Men spoke her name in whispers, some in reverence, others in fear. And in the dark corners of taverns and keeps, the hunters began to stir. The child of elder blood was no longer a myth. She was flesh, she was breath, and the world wanted her. Geralt kept moving. He crossed rivers that froze at night and thawed with the morning. He passed through towns where the people bowed their heads, not in respect, but in dread. The scent of war clung to everything. Armies gathered in silence. Old powers woke in their graves. Somewhere beyond the horizon, kings and sorceresses whispered of a prophecy, a child born beneath stars and storm who would end one age and begin another. But he did not see prophecy. He saw only a girl who laughed softly when the rain touched her face, who collected flowers that would wilt by morning, who still believed that light could live in the ruins. He taught her as Vesemir had taught him, how to listen to the silence before danger came, how to stand her ground when the world told her to run. She was quick, and her will was sharp as tempered steel. But what set her apart was not strength nor skill. It was her heart, the unyielding pulse of compassion that refused to harden. There were nights when she would wake from dreams she could not name. Her eyes would open, wide and unfocused, and for a moment she would speak in a voice that was not her own, soft, distant, and heavy with memory. The air around her would hum, and the stars themselves seemed to bend closer to listen. When she slept again, the stillness would return, and Geralt would sit beside her, staring into the dark, his thoughts heavy with the truth he could never say aloud. He knew what she was, what she could become. The elder blood was both gift and curse, a current of power that could not be stopped, only guided. and he, who had never sought to shape destiny, now carried it in his care. As the months passed, the signs became clearer. Storms rose where she walked. Time itself seemed to hesitate, as though uncertain how to move in her presence. Once, while crossing an old battlefield, she had knelt among the bones, and the air had grown warm. The snow melted. Flowers bloomed from the ashes. Geralt had stood in silence, watching, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, not from fear, but awe. She looked up then, her eyes reflecting the golden light of something unseen, and for the briefest moment, the Witcher thought he understood. The elder blood did not destroy, it remembered. It was memory itself, of all that had been, of all that might be again. Still, the world would not let her be. Hunters trailed them through the north, men who served no king but the promise of power. They followed quietly at first, then with growing desperation, their greed louder than their steps. The land itself seemed to turn against them, the weather colder, the nights longer. Yet always, Geralt led her onward, his pace steady, his silence her shield. They found shelter in the mountains once more. The wind there was sharper, the air thin with altitude. They made camp beneath an overhang of stone, and as night fell, the stars stretched endlessly above them. Ciri sat near the edge, watching the sky, her hair glowing faintly in the starlight. Geralt watched her from the shadows, the firelight tracing the sharpness of his face. She was growing into something the world would not understand, something he could not protect her from forever, but he would try. That above all was what it meant to bear the law of surprise, not ownership, but duty. A promise unspoken, kept not because fate demanded it, but because love did when she slept. He looked toward the horizon. The wind moved softly through the pines, carrying the faint scent of snow and thunder. The storm was coming. He could feel it, the gathering of powers, the hum of destiny waking from its long slumber. The world was shifting, and somewhere in that vast design, a witcher and a child of prophecy stood together at its heart. He closed his eyes, listening to the breath of the mountain. The wolves began to howl below, their voices rising through the valley, carried by the night air. It was a sound both mournful and proud, a hymn for those who endured the cold. And in that song, Geralt heard what he had always known, that this child was not the end of his path, but its beginning. The fire burned low, its light flickering across their faces, one shaped by time and sorrow, the other by destiny not yet revealed. The snow began to fall again, soft and endless, as though the heavens themselves wished to hide them from what waited beyond the dawn. The world slept. But destiny did not. The mountain slept beneath the weight of the stars, its white slopes glimmering faintly in the pale light. The world around them was still, the kind of stillness that came before storms, when the wind dared not move and the air itself seemed to wait. Geralt sat beside the fire, the hood of his cloak drawn low, his eyes fixed on the slow rise and fall of Ciri's breath. She had changed again. Not in the way children grow, but in the quiet, unseen way that only those touched by power ever do. Her features had sharpened, her gaze had grown distant. Sometimes, when she looked at him, he felt as though she saw more than what stood before her, as if she saw through the world itself, into the invisible threads that wove all things together. There were moments when her presence made the very air tremble. A faint hum beneath the earth, a flicker in the firelight, the whisper of voices in a language too old for human tongues. Geralt never asked her what she felt during those times. He knew the answer would be beyond words. They traveled down from the mountains at dawn, the snow giving way to wet earth and thawing rivers. Spring had begun its slow return, but the warmth never reached them fully. The path wound through lands scarred by war, villages half-burned, fields turned to mud, the smell of smoke thick even after the fires had died. The world was trying to heal, but it did so uneasily, as though afraid of its own scars. And through that broken land, the child of elder blood walked. There were eyes everywhere now, not of beasts, but of men. The word had spread faster than fire. A girl with silver hair, a witch's ward, a child marked by prophecy. Some sought her for her blood, others for her power, others still to destroy what they did not understand. Geralt felt them before he saw them. Shadows at the edges of the forest, distant footfalls that did not belong to travelers. The medallion at his neck thrummed softly, a low vibration that carried not danger, but inevitability. He knew what it meant. Fate was no longer following them. It was closing in one night. As they made camp near the ruins of an old fortress, the wind changed. It came down from the north, carrying the scent of iron and frost. The fire dimmed, flickering as though the air itself were holding its breath. Ciri sat by the flames, her hands wrapped around her knees, her eyes fixed on the dark horizon. The power came then, not as light or sound, but as silence. A silence so deep that the forest seemed to vanish within it. The earth trembled softly beneath her, and for a moment, time itself hesitated. The stars above flickered, their reflections caught in her eyes. Geralt rose slowly, watching her not with fear but with understanding. He had seen many kinds of power in his life, but never one that felt so alive. Ciri's breath caught, her pupils widened. The air shimmered faintly around her, and the fire bent toward her as though drawn by a hidden gravity. The whispering returned, faint, melodic, the sound of something ancient remembering itself. Then, as quickly as it began, it was gone. The fire straightened, the wind returned, and the night exhaled. She looked up at him. There was no fear in her face, only calm, as if some great truth had been revealed in silence. Geralt did not ask what she had seen. He knew that whatever it was, it belonged to her alone. The elder blood did not answer to those who sought to understand it. It moved like the wind, free, untamed, and eternal. The following days passed in uneasy peace. The forest seemed to part for them now, its shadows gentler, its paths clearer. Geralt had walked these lands for decades, but never had they felt so changed. Even the monsters kept their distance. It was as if the world itself recognized her and chose to bow its head in quiet respect. And yet, not all things that bowed did so willingly. Far beyond the woods, in the halls of marble and fire, those who ruled began to speak her name with hunger. The sorceresses gathered in secret, the kings sharpened their knives, and the wild hunt, that ghostly cavalcade of riders from beyond the veil, stirred once more from their endless chase. The blood of the elder called to them. They would come for her. Geralt knew it. He had known it since the moment he lifted her from the wreckage years ago. He had told himself he could keep her hidden, that the world would forget her if they stayed quiet enough. But destiny, he had learned, does not forget what it has chosen. When the first snow of winter returned, they found themselves once again on the path to Kaer Morhen. The old fortress rose from the fog like a ghost, its towers pale against the mountains. Geralt had not planned to return, but he felt the pull, the same instinct that had guided him all his life, the same whisper that told him where danger would strike. The keep was empty when they arrived, its gates heavy with frost. Geralt lit the fires in the great hall, the smoke curling upward into the rafters. Ciri stood at the center of the room, her eyes tracing the carvings along the walls, the sigils, the scars, the history carved into stone. She said nothing, but her hand brushed the table where Vesemir once sat, and for a moment her face softened with something like peace. She belonged here, and yet she did not. She was both part of the Witcher's legacy and beyond it. The blood that ran through her veins was not bound to swords or schools. It was the inheritance of stars, the echo of the first magic that had ever touched the world. Geralt watched her move through the hall, her steps slow, deliberate. The light caught her hair, and for an instant she seemed to glow. He thought of the boy he had once been, trembling beneath the hands of alchemists, changed by fire and potion into something no longer quite human. And he thought of her, born from prophecy, carrying within her the promise of creation itself. He had been made to hunt monsters. She had been born to end them. That night, the snow fell thicker than before. The wind howled against the stones, but the fire held strong. Ciri sat beside it, her eyes closed, her breath steady. The warmth of the flames brushed against her skin, and in the quiet rhythm of her breathing, Geralt felt something he had not felt in years. Hope. It was fragile, uncertain, and fleeting, but it was there. Not for himself, but for her, and for whatever world she might one day build. A world where witches were not needed, where destiny was no longer a chain, but a choice. The snow buried the keep by morning. The world outside slept beneath a shroud of white. Inside, the fire burned low, its light soft and golden. Ciri stirred in her sleep, murmuring words too faint to hear. The air shimmered briefly, the medallion on Geralt's chest trembling once before falling still. He reached out and placed a hand over hers. Her skin was warm. Outside, the wind changed again. It carried no warning this time, only a whisper, quiet and endless, like the first note of a song not yet written. The storm would come soon. The world would turn. But for this single night, the path was still. And in the heart of Kaer Morhen, surrounded by ghosts and silence, destiny rested not in prophecy nor power, but in the fragile bond between a man who was made and a girl who was born to become. She was born in winter, not the gentle hush of snow, but the kind that broke the earth. The air had been bitter and dry that night in Vengerberg, the streets slick with frost, the sky stretched taut with silence. No one marked her birth with joy. No bells were rung, no prayers spoken. Her mother looked away, her father spat, and the world continued, indifferent. The child was small, frail, her spine twisted, her limbs uneven. She did not cry. The midwife whispered the word deformed and crossed herself. They named her Yennefer, though no one called her by it kindly. She grew among shadows and half-heard words, a ghost in her own home, a reminder of what her parents had wished to forget. But fate does not favor beauty. It favors will. And even then, even as a girl, Yennefer's will was iron beneath the softness of her skin. She watched the world that pitied her and decided quietly that she would make it kneel. The years that followed were long and cruel. She learned to walk with pain, to speak only when words mattered. Children mocked her, adults looked away. But in solitude, she discovered something that others could not see, the thin shimmer of energy that lay beneath all things. The pulse of existence itself. The first whisper of magic. It began with small things. A candle that burned too brightly when she was near. A mirror that cracked when she looked into it too long. The wind stirring without reason. Her father called it witchcraft, her mother called it curse. But Yennefer understood it as something else entirely, a truth. The world responded to her not with scorn, but with fear. And fear was power waiting to be named. When the mages came, cloaked in violet and silver, they took her without asking. Her father sold her for a handful of coins and a bottle of mead. She did not look back. The halls of Arethusa were cold and endless, filled with the scent of ink, candle wax, and ambition. It was here that girls like her were remade, their bodies and minds forged into vessels for magic, their souls tempered in secrecy and pain. The masters spoke of discipline, of sacrifice, of balance. Yennefer listened, learned, and remembered everything. She endured the lessons others could not. They broke her again and again, stripped her pride, twisted her spirit, taught her to obey. But she learned more quickly than they expected. Her hunger for mastery was not born of vanity, it was born of survival. Every humiliation, every cruel word, every scar carved into her will, she turned them all into fuel. And when the time came, when the transformation was offered, that final, terrible gift of beauty and power, she accepted without hesitation. The ritual was agony. It tore her apart and rebuilt her, bone by bone, nerve by nerve. Her screams filled the chamber until even the stones seemed to tremble. When it was over and she opened her eyes, the girl was gone. The hunchbacked child of Vengerberg had been replaced by something both divine and dangerous. Her reflection was no longer familiar. Her back was straight, her limbs perfect, her face radiant. The world that had once turned from her now turned toward her, in awe, in envy, in desire. But beneath that beauty, the same will remained, the same iron that had refused to break. Yennefer of Vengerberg had been born again, not by grace, but by defiance. The years that followed were marked by ascent. She climbed through the ranks of mages and courts with quiet precision, her power as effortless as her poise. Kings sought her counsel, nobles whispered her name in candlelit rooms. She moved through the world like a shadow of silk and flame, leaving both admiration and unease in her wake. Yet for all her mastery, the ache within her never dimmed. Beauty had not healed the wound, it had only given it form. There were nights when she sat before the mirror and stared into her own eyes, searching for the girl she had once been. She could not find her. The transformation had taken more than her deformity. It had taken the fragile part of her that still believed love was something freely given. Power had replaced it. Power, and the loneliness that followed it everywhere. She came to understand that every gift magic gave required a sacrifice. To gain beauty, she had given away the chance to bear life. To gain mastery, she had surrendered peace. And to gain freedom, she had bound herself forever to the expectations of others. To kings, to councils, to the restless whisper of destiny. It was in those years of cold brilliance that she first heard the name of the Witcher, Geralt of Rivia, the White Wolf. A man made by alchemy, just as she had been remade by magic. A creature caught between worlds, neither fully human nor truly other. She had laughed when she first heard of him, a killer of monsters with eyes like molten gold. But when she met him, the laughter died. He was unlike the others. He did not flinch before her, nor did he fall to admiration. His silence was steady, unshaken, and she found herself drawn to it as one is drawn to fire. It was not love, not at first. Love was a word too soft for what existed between them. It was recognition. Two souls carved by pain, meeting at the edge of what remained human in them both. They circled one another like storms, drawn together, torn apart, and drawn again. Every meeting between them burned with the unspoken understanding that they were both too broken to belong anywhere else. And yet, in their brief moments of calm, she found something she had never known, the quiet of being seen. He looked at her not as a sorceress, not as a legend, but as a woman. And in his gaze, she remembered what it felt like to be whole, if only for a heartbeat. But love, like magic, demanded sacrifice. Their fates would not remain their own. In time, she would meet the child who carried the world's future in her blood, the girl who would become the daughter she was never meant to have. In Ciri's eyes, Yennefer would see both her redemption and her ruin, the living proof that destiny was not bound by nature's laws. For now, though, she walked the marble halls of power, her steps echoing through the chambers of kings and ghosts alike. The scent of lilac and gooseberries followed her like a promise or a curse. She wielded her beauty like a blade and her mind like fire. But when the world grew quiet, when the candles dimmed and the night stretched long, she still dreamed of the girl from Vengerberg, alone in the cold, whispering to the wind that one day the world would remember her name. And it did. But memory, like magic, always comes at a cost. The years passed like seasons in disguise, warm, cold, and unending. Yennefer of Vengerberg became both legend and warning, her name whispered in halls where men feared beauty that could not be controlled. She had risen high among the ranks of sorceresses, her will sharper than any blade, her gaze enough to silence kings. Yet with every spell woven, every victory claimed, she felt something within her slip further away. The world saw only her perfection, the elegance, the voice, the power that wrapped itself around every room she entered. But Yennefer knew the truth. She carried within her a hollow space, an echo left behind by the girl she had once been. It was not emptiness born of weakness, but of longing, a quiet ache that no magic could heal. Her life was marked by control. Every gesture precise, every word deliberate. But beneath that control burned a hunger that even she feared, the desire to create life. The very thing she had sacrificed when she traded her broken body for beauty. That choice, made in youth and pride, haunted her more deeply than any curse. In dreams, she sometimes saw herself holding a child who would vanish with the dawn. Each morning she woke with her hand outstretched, reaching for something that was never there. It was this ache that drove her, though she would never speak of it aloud. The conclave called her ambitious, the kings called her dangerous. They were both right. Yet even as she sat beside thrones and shaped the fates of empires, she felt herself drifting further from what she truly sought. The Witcher had come and gone by then, a shadow in her story, or perhaps she in his. Their meetings were rare, their silences long, their partings inevitable. They were alike in all the ways that kept them apart. Both creatures remade, both prisoners of their own design. But every time their paths crossed, the world seemed to grow quieter. Yennefer never understood why he lingered in her thoughts after he was gone. Perhaps because he was the only one who had ever seen through her, not as a sorceress to be feared or desired, but as a woman still fighting to forgive herself. He never tried to save her, and that, she thought, was his truest kindness. There were nights when she found herself in distant inns, surrounded by the hum of strangers and the scent of rain, and she would think of him, the steady rhythm of his silence, the way his eyes held the weight of 1,000 choices he would never explain. And though she had sworn to need no one, the thought of him would still find her, as constant as the tide. It was destiny that brought them together again. Not love, not choice, but the same invisible current that had bound their lives long before they ever met. By then, Ciri's name had begun to echo across the world. The child of elder blood, the girl who could walk between worlds, the one prophecy called the end and beginning of all things. When Yennefer first saw her, she felt something shift inside her that no magic could touch. The girl's presence was familiar, not in face but in spirit. She carried the same defiance, the same quiet pain. Yennefer looked into her eyes and saw the reflection of the child she could never have. In that moment, her longing ceased to be a wound. It became a purpose. She became a mother not through blood, but through will, the same will that had carried her from deformity to divinity. And in guiding Ciri, she found herself changing once more. The power that had once been her armor became her burden. She learned to protect not for glory, but for love. Together, the three of them, Witcher, sorceress, and child, formed a bond that defied every law of the world. Geralt's silence, Yennefer's fire, Ciri's light. 3 lives drawn together by threads no blade could sever, but the world would not let them rest. The wild hunt came first, riders cloaked in storm and bone, their arrival marked by frost and the distant sound of horns. They sought Ciri not for her heart, but for her power, the blood that could open the doors between worlds. And when they came, it was Yennefer who stood in their path, her magic blazing white against the black of their approach. The sky split. The air screamed. She felt the old power surge through her veins, raw and furious. Fire and lightning burst from her hands, each strike tearing through the shadows like the breath of gods. But the hunt did not break. They were not bound by mortal limits. When it was over, the ground was scorched, the night still trembling. Geralt found her on her knees, her strength spent, her hands bleeding where the power had burned through flesh. Ciri lay unconscious beside her, untouched. Yennefer looked up at him then, her face pale, her eyes burning not with rage but with sorrow. She had won, but she had felt the cost. Magic, she understood at last, was not creation. It was sacrifice. They fled then, moving through lands broken by war and ruin. Yennefer grew quieter with each passing day, her voice now soft where once it had been sharp. There was no longer space for pride, no time for vanity. She had found something greater than either, devotion. The kind that asks for nothing in return. Ciri's power grew with each moon, her dreams filled with voices calling her beyond the veil. Yennefer watched her as a mother watches the horizon, with hope, with fear, and with the ache of knowing that every dawn brought her closer to loss. She had spent her life trying to master fate. Now she learned the grace of surrender. In the end, she understood what the mages of Aretusa never taught her, that the greatest power lies not in bending the world, but in loving it enough to let it break your heart. On the last night before the storm, before destiny came to claim what it had long prepared, she sat by the fire, her hands folded, her gaze distant. The scent of lilac drifted in the air, faint and familiar. Geralt stood a few paces away, silent as ever. Neither spoke. There was no need. Ciri slept between them, her breath steady, her face peaceful. The firelight shimmered across their faces, three souls bound by choice, by chance, by something that no longer needed a name. The night stretched endlessly, soft and golden. Yennefer's eyes closed for a moment, and in the quiet between heartbeats, she thought of the girl she had once been, the child of pain, the woman of fire, the mother of destiny. She had searched her whole life for meaning. And she found it not in power, but in love, the kind that asks nothing but the courage to stay. When dawn came, it was gentle. The light touched the world like forgiveness, and for the first time in her life, Yennefer did not feel the need to be stronger. She was enough. They called them monsters, the drowners, the leshens, the wyverns and wraiths that haunted the forgotten edges of the world. Creatures born of shadow and hunger, twisted by curse or chaos. Geralt had hunted them all. He had seen their eyes, smelled their blood, heard the dying growls that carried no language, only instinct. He knew their savagery, their beauty, their tragedy. But as the years pressed on and the path grew longer, he began to understand a quieter truth, that monsters were not the ones who lurked in forests or lairs, but those who walked freely under the sun. The ones who built cities, wrote laws, wore crowns. The ones who smiled as they killed, who burned for righteousness and called it order. It was not the claws or fangs that made them terrible. It was their certainty. Geralt had seen enough wars to know how men justified their hunger. He had ridden past fields sown not with wheat, but with bones, the aftermath of kings chasing pride disguised as destiny. He had seen villages razed for faith, families torn apart for land, and children hanged for the sins of those who had claimed to protect them. And every time, when he came to collect his coin, there would be someone waiting to tell him that it was all necessary. The Witcher never argued. He had learned that truth was a blade with no handle. To touch, it was to bleed. Once, he arrived at a town on the edge of the Yaruga, where the air reeked of smoke and salt. The people there spoke in whispers of a beast that had taken their dead, dragging them from graves under the cover of fog. He followed the trail into the marsh and found the creature. It was no beast at all, but a man, pale, desperate, starved, surviving on what the war had left behind. The villagers called him a ghoul. Geralt looked at him and saw only hunger. When he returned to the town, he said nothing. The people paid him in silence. That night, the fog came again, and in the morning, another man was gone. He left before dawn. He stopped counting the years. The path blurred between kingdoms and ruins, between the wild and the walls. Each place carried the same story, people killing in fear of what they did not understand, praying to gods that never answered, calling for witches when the things they had birthed themselves began to howl. He began to wonder if the monsters had ever truly been separate at all. In Redania, he found himself standing before a pyre. Flames licked the night air, turning the snow to steam. A sorceress burned upon it, her face hidden by smoke, her cries drowned by the chanting of the crowd. They called her evil. They said she had cursed their harvests, stolen their children, poisoned their wells. The Witcher watched without moving. He had met her once long ago, when her voice had been gentle and her magic kind. She had healed a farmer's wife, asked for no coin. But when drought came, they remembered only her power, not her mercy. When the fire died, the people cheered. They believed the world was purer now. Geralt turned away, the smell of ash heavy in his throat. In another village, far from any road, he was called to slay a monster said to haunt the forest. He followed the tracks through frost and fog until he came upon a clearing where a woman sat beside a small, shallow grave. Her hair was white with age, her hands raw from the cold. She looked up when he approached and whispered, "They said my boy was cursed, that he brought death. I buried him here so they would stop." There was no monster, only grief. He left the contract unpaid. Over time, the line between human and beast blurred until it ceased to matter. He began to see the same eyes in both, the flicker of fear, the hunger to survive, the rage born of being cornered. Monsters killed because they were driven to it. Men killed because they chose to. The Witcher no longer knew which was worse. Once in a city gilded by war and rot, he was summoned to the court of a duke who kept trophies, heads of beasts mounted upon the walls, their eyes replaced with jewels. The duke greeted him warmly, offered wine, spoke of glory and honor. He led Geralt through the hall, naming each creature as if reciting scripture. When they reached the end, the Witcher saw it, a human skull among them, small, delicate, a child's. The duke noticed his silence and smiled. "A lesson," he said, "for those who think they are above the natural order." That night, the duke was found dead in his chamber, his heart stopped cleanly, his face untouched. No blade, no mark, no proof. The city called it witchcraft. Geralt never returned. In time, he stopped seeking contracts altogether. The path no longer felt like duty, but penance, a quiet reckoning for all that he had seen and done. He did not believe in redemption, but he believed in balance. If there were creatures that deserved to die, then there were men who deserved to be remembered. The farmers, the mothers, the children whose names no bard would ever sing. He buried them when he could. He lit candles for them when he couldn't. He found solace not in victory, but in small mercies, a beast spared when it did no harm, a traveler guided through a storm, a field of flowers left untouched after battle. The world would never be kind, but it did not need to be cruel. The longer he lived, the more he understood that the monsters he hunted were mirrors. Every claw and tooth reflected something human. Every scream of rage echoed something familiar. And when he looked into their eyes, he no longer saw evil, only sorrow wearing the shape of survival. The Witcher had been made to kill monsters, but somewhere along the way, he had learned the harder task, to forgive them, and in that forgiveness, he began to forgive himself. The road stretched before him, endless, grey, familiar. The air was heavy with the promise of rain. Somewhere behind him, kingdoms burned and kings schemed, but he did not turn back. He had seen enough of men pretending to be gods. He walked on, his boots sinking into the wet earth, his shadow long across the dying light. The wind carried the faint scent of lilac, and for a moment he almost smiled. The wolves howled in the distance. It was not a warning. It was a hymn, low and mournful, but alive. He listened until the sound faded, then continued walking, alone yet never truly so. For the first time, he understood that monsters were not his curse. They were his mirror. And in the reflection, he finally saw the truth, that humanity, in all its cruelty and grace, had always been the most beautiful monster of all. The sky was iron grey when he woke. A thin mist lay across the ground, soft and colourless, muffling the shapes of trees and stones. The air was still, heavy with the scent of wet soil and wood smoke. Geralt sat beside the remains of his fire, staring into the ashes. The embers had gone cold, but a faint wisp of heat lingered, the last breath of a night that had already forgotten itself. He had dreamed again. Not of beasts or battle, but of faces. The faces of men, those he had saved, those he had killed, those who had cursed his name. They all blurred together now, their voices fading as if called from beneath water. He did not fear these dreams. He only listened. Somewhere within them was a question that had followed him all his life, a question without an answer. When does the monster stop being the thing you hunt and start being the thing you become? He rose slowly, the leather of his armor stiff from dew. The medallion at his chest hung silent. No magic stirred nearby. The forest was peaceful. or as close to peace as this world ever came. But the silence held something that felt older than calm, something watchful. The road ahead wound through a valley of forgotten graves. Stones tilted at strange angles, names worn away by time and rain. He walked among them without speaking. The path curved, and soon the ruins of a small village appeared, roofs collapsed, wells dry, doors hanging from rusted hinges. The wind moved through it, carrying only the memory of voices. He stopped before one of the houses. The walls were burned black, the air faintly bitter with old smoke. Inside, he found the remnants of a table, a chair, a child's wooden toy. Nothing else. No bones, no bodies. Only the emptiness left behind when fear devours everything that once lived. Geralt stepped outside and stood beneath the grey sky. The clouds moved slowly, their shadows sweeping across the land. He knew this place. He had been here before, years ago, when the villagers had called him to slay a creature that came at night. They had said it stole their livestock, poisoned their wells, dragged the sick into the woods. He had killed it, a bruxa, they said. A monster with pale skin and eyes like stars. He remembered the fight, the blur of motion, the hiss of claws, the spray of blood. But he remembered, too, the sound she made when she fell. Not a scream, a sigh, almost human. Afterward, the village had celebrated. They had paid him well. They had thanked him. But the next morning, the river ran red, and the village was gone. No one had needed to tell him why. The bruxa had not come to feed. She had come to protect. The villagers had killed her children first. He had not returned since that day. Now, standing among the ruins, the truth settled like snow over the years of silence. The ashes had grown cold. The bones had turned to dust, but guilt did not fade. It lived quietly beneath the skin, like an ember waiting for air. Geralt knelt and touched the ground. It was soft, rich with the memory of rain. He closed his eyes and bowed his head. There were no prayers for witches, no gods who listened, but this small act, this stillness, was enough. When he rose again, the wind had changed. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, human, thin, wrapped in a cloak that fluttered faintly in the breeze. The stranger did not move, only watched. Geralt waited. The man approached slowly, his steps careful, his face drawn with hunger and weariness. "You're the Witcher," he said, though it was not a question. Geralt said nothing. "They said you could tell monsters from men." The man's voice trembled. "Tell me then, what am I?" The Witcher studied him for a long moment. The man's eyes were dark, but not from corruption. His hands shook not with rage, but with fear. Around his neck hung a string of teeth, human, animal, impossible to tell. "You're alive," Geralt said finally. The man laughed. It was not a happy sound. "That's not what I asked." He turned and walked away before Geralt could answer. When the mist closed behind him, the Witcher felt something old stir inside. That quiet ache that came whenever he saw what people became when left too long with their own ghosts. Monsters were not born from curses alone. They were born from grief that found no voice, from guilt that found no forgiveness. And if that was true, then perhaps the line he walked had never truly existed. By nightfall, he had reached the edge of the forest. The moon rose pale and distant, its light filtering through the branches like smoke. He made camp beneath a dead tree, its roots curling through the soil like the hands of the buried. The fire caught slowly, small flames licking the darkness. He sat beside it, his sword laid across his knees, and listened to the night. Far off, a wolf howled. Others answered, their voices threading through the cold air. It was a sound both lonely and alive, the kind of sound that reminded him that the world still breathed, no matter how much it bled. He thought then of the faces that had shaped him. Vesemir, patient and tired. Yennefer, fierce and fragile. Ciri, radiant as dawn. And beneath them all, the faces of the ones he had killed, monsters, men, sometimes both. He had spent a lifetime standing between two worlds. And now, as the fire burned low, he wondered if that was his punishment or his grace. He had been made to bring death, but in that endless act, He had learned to love life more fiercely than those who feared losing it. The irony did not escape him. It was almost cruel. The night deepened. The fire dimmed to embers. The world was quiet again. He closed his eyes and listened to his heartbeat. Slow, steady, human, or close enough. Perhaps that was enough. Perhaps the difference between a monster and a man was not what they were made of, but what they chose to remember. When dawn came, it was silver and soft. The mist lifted, revealing a valley washed clean by rain. The graves shimmered faintly in the light, each one crowned with dew. The Witcher stood, his shadow long against the morning. He fastened his cloak, sheathed his blade, and began to walk. The path stretched ahead, unending as always. But for the first time in a long while, he felt no weight pressing against his shoulders. He would hunt again. He would kill again, but he would also remember. He would remember that monsters, like men, were only stories the world told itself to make sense of its own cruelty. And if he was both, if he was the blade and the scar, the hunter and the haunted, then so be it. For in a world that had forgotten the meaning of mercy, even a monster could choose to be kind. The wind rose behind him, carrying with it the distant call of wolves. He listened until it faded, then whispered to no one in particular, a vow, soft as smoke. I will not forget. Then he walked on, into the light that broke quietly over the hills, where even the shadows seemed to rest. The sun was low when he reached the river. It shone through the mist in pale threads, gilding the surface of the water in soft gold. The world was still, no voices, no bells, only the whisper of wind and the quiet creak of his armor as he walked. His boots sank slightly in the damp soil. He did not hurry. The path had taught him that nothing worth finding was ever found in haste. He followed the current until it curved toward a bend lined with reeds and the skeletons of old trees. The air smelled faintly of salt, though the sea was far away. Perhaps it was only memory, the scent of another shore, another lifetime. Geralt stopped and looked out across the water. The surface was smooth, reflecting the grey of the sky. He could almost see himself there, the white hair, the scar across his cheek, the yellow eyes that had frightened so many and comforted so few. Time had not touched him much. The Witcher's body aged slowly, but his soul carried centuries. Every kill, every silence, every face that had slipped beyond his reach. There was no contract to fulfill here. No beast to slay, no coin to claim. Only a sense, quiet but insistent, that his road had led him to this river not by chance, but by design. He made camp by the water's edge. The firelight flickered against the hollow curve of twilight, painting the reeds in shades of amber and shadow. Somewhere beyond the hills, a storm was brewing. The scent of rain hung in the air, patient and distant. Geralt sat beside the flames and listened. The sound of the crackling wood merged with the murmur of the river. It was a melody he knew well, one that spoke not of endings, but of continuance. The same sound that had followed him all his life, the heartbeat of the world that endured even when men did not. He took his sword and placed it on the ground before him. The steel caught the firelight, gleaming faintly like a dying star. He traced his fingers along its edge, not with the care of a warrior, but with the tenderness of a craftsman remembering his first creation. Every nick, every stain was a history written in silence. Once, this blade had been his voice. Now it was simply weight, a reminder of what had been done and what no longer needed doing. He thought of Kaer Morhen, of Vesemir's calm patience and the smell of snow against stone. He thought of Yennefer, her laughter sharp as broken glass and her touch soft as breath. He thought of Ciri, her hair wild in the wind, her eyes bright with wonder. Each name was a thread, and together they wove the only truth he had ever believed in. That love, however fleeting, was worth every scar it left behind. The night deepened. The stars emerged, faint at first, then countless, a tapestry of light stitched across the dark. He leaned back, resting on his elbows, and looked up. The constellations were the same as they had always been. Men had given them names, heroes, beasts, gods, but to him, they were simply stories written in fire. and perhaps that was all life ever was, a brief flame, burning just long enough to be remembered. The wolves began to sing in the distance. Their voices rose and fell like waves, filling the air with something both mournful and eternal. He listened, and for the first time in years, he felt no need to move. The white wolf had hunted his whole life. But now, as the sound of his kin drifted across the night, he realized that the hunt had never truly been for monsters or coin. It had been for meaning, and meaning, he found, was not in the killing but in the endurance. The wind shifted. It carried with it the faint scent of lilac. He closed his eyes. For a heartbeat, he could almost see her, Yennefer, standing in the distance, her hair catching the starlight, her eyes softened by something that looked like forgiveness. She did not speak. She never needed to. Ciri's laughter followed, clear as the sound of bells. It wove through the wind, through the whisper of the trees, through the pulse of his own heart. He opened his eyes and found the world unchanged, and yet, for that moment, it felt whole. He took a slow breath. The fire had burned low, its embers pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. The cold crept closer, curling around his boots, but it no longer bit. He remembered what Vesemir had once told him on a winter night long ago, when the storms had battered the keep and the younger witches had slept. There will come a day, boy, when you'll put down your sword. Not because you've grown too old to carry it, but because you'll no longer need it. Geralt had not understood then. He did now. He leaned forward, lifted the sword, and pressed its tip into the ground beside the fire. The steel caught the light once more, then dimmed. The river murmured softly, as if in approval. The first drops of rain began to fall. Slow, deliberate, each one striking the water with a sound like breath. The storm was near now, though it came gently, like a hand closing over the world. He sat there unmoving, until the flames died and the stars blurred behind the curtain of rain. The cold seeped through his cloak, through his bones, but he felt no discomfort, only a strange lightness, as if the years had finally begun to lift from his shoulders. The path had no end, he had once believed, but perhaps that was the mistake. Perhaps it was not meant to be endless but circular, each road folding back to its beginning, each story ending where another began. He looked toward the horizon. Dawn was approaching, faint and gray, the light creeping across the mist. The river shimmered under it, endless and alive. He could hear the wolves again, closer now, their song rising through the fading rain. He smiled then, small, almost imperceptible, and whispered, "Not yet." He rose, gathered his things, and turned from the river. The morning air was cool, the kind that promised renewal rather than decay. His steps were slower now, but steady. The path stretched ahead through the forest, winding between trees that seemed to breathe with him. He walked until the sound of the water faded, until the world became only the rhythm of his boots against the earth and the whisper of wind through the leaves. Each step felt lighter than the last. Each breath felt new. The witcher's journey was not one of conquest. It never had been. It was a song, not sung, but lived. And though the verses had grown quiet, the melody remained. He did not know where the path would take him now, perhaps to Kaer Morhen, perhaps to Yennefer, perhaps to the quiet beyond the horizon where no contracts waited and no beasts roamed. But wherever it led, he would follow. Not as a killer, not as a savior, but as a man who had finally learned that even the darkest stories could end in peace. The wind rose behind him again, carrying the sound of the wolves' final chorus. He stopped once, listening. Their song was not farewell. It was recognition. Then he walked on, through the mist and the light, until both became one. And somewhere, far beyond the world of men and monsters, the white wolf rested, not in death, but in the quiet that comes when every hunt is done, and the soul remembers the song it was always meant to sing. The rain had long stopped. What remained was the scent, that soft, clean fragrance that lingers when the world has washed itself of dust and sorrow. The forest was quiet, its branches heavy with drops that caught the newborn sunlight and scattered it like glass. Geralt walked beneath them, his cloak damp, his hair silvered not by age but by mourning. Each step sank lightly into the earth, the soil dark and rich from the storm. The path stretched forward, winding between the trees like a memory that refused to fade. He did not hurry. There was no longer a destination, no promise beyond the next breath. For the first time, he was content not to arrive. In the distance, a river glimmered through the fog, wide and still, a mirror of the waking sky. He followed its sound until he reached the bank. The water moved slowly, carrying leaves and fragments of light. He crouched beside it and touched the surface with his hand. It was cold, but not unkind. The ripples spread outward, distorting his reflection, the familiar face that had haunted so many tales. He no longer recognized it. The lines that time had carved were not from battle or age, but from endurance. His eyes, once sharp and wary, now carried a softness that surprised him. Perhaps, he thought, this was what peace looked like, not joy, not triumph, but stillness. He had not spoken in days. The silence had become its own language. The world no longer demanded explanations, and he had none left to give. He rose and looked toward the horizon. The light there was gentle, not golden or red, but silver, the color of old stories and forgotten dreams. Beyond it lay Kaer Morhen, though he did not need to see the path to know it was there. The keep was etched into his bones, the echo of steel against stone, the laughter of ghosts in the courtyard, the scent of pine and frost. He wondered if the wind still howled through its empty halls, carrying the names of those who had once called it home. Perhaps he would return. Perhaps he would not. Some places belonged more to memory than to the living. He walked along the river until the land began to open, wide fields dotted with the ruins of what had once been villages. Grass had grown through the stones. Flowers pushed through the cracks. The world, as it always did, had learned to forget. Here, where men had once burned and bled, there was peace. He found an old oak standing alone at the crest of a hill. Its branches reached toward the sky, black and bare against the light. He stopped there, his hand brushing the rough bark. Beneath it, he could feel the pulse of life, slow, steady, endless. He sat at its roots and let the wind speak. It carried the whispers of the world, faint, fragmented. The cries of ravens far away, the sigh of water against stone, the laughter of some unseen traveler carried from a distant road. All of it blending into something whole, something eternal. He closed his eyes, and the memories began to unfold. Kaer Morhen in winter, snow thick against the battlements, the fires burning low. Vesemir's patient voice, teaching lessons that would outlive even time. The girl with the ashen hair, laughing as she ran through the courtyard, her wooden sword clashing against his steel. Yennefer, standing in the doorway, her eyes reflecting both flame and frost, the wind through the mountains, carrying their names long after their voices had gone. He had carried them all within him, these ghosts of his heart. They were the truest weight he had ever known, and now, at last, they felt light. The world had always told stories of witches, songs sung by travelers in taverns, half-truths traded in the dark. They spoke of monsters slain, of cold hearts and cursed men. But none of them had known this, the quiet beneath the legend, the tenderness that survived the killing, the small mercies that defined the man within the myth. Geralt had been many things: weapon, wanderer, lover, father. But in the end, he was only this, a soul who walked through darkness and still chose the light. He lay back against the roots of the tree and watched the sky. The clouds moved slowly, their edges brushed with pale fire. A hawk circled far above, its wings spread wide, unhurried. He envied it not its freedom, but its simplicity. The bird did not question why it flew, it simply did. A soft wind moved through the grass, whispering through the leaves. It carried with it the faintest scent, lilac and gooseberries. He smiled. The memory was not cruel this time. It was gentle, like a hand resting against his shoulder. He could almost hear her voice. Not words, only presence. Then Ciri's laughter again, distant, bright, unbroken. He did not reach for them. Some things are not meant to be touched twice. He breathed deeply, feeling the air fill his lungs. The world was vast, and for the first time he did not feel small within it. Somewhere beyond the hills, the sun began to set. The light spread across the fields in soft waves, turning the grass to gold. The shadows stretched long and slow. The wind grew warmer. He thought of the fire that had once consumed him: rage, guilt, purpose. It had burned bright, fierce, and necessary. But every flame must fade. What mattered was not the blaze itself, but what remained when it was gone. And in that fading, he found peace. The wolves began to sing again as twilight deepened. Their voices rose and fell with the rhythm of the wind, their song carrying across the fields. It was the same song they had always sung, of the hunt, of the moon, of the night that follows every day. Geralt listened, and the corners of his lips lifted faintly. The sound was not a call to battle. It was a call home. He closed his eyes. The world dimmed, not into darkness, but into calm. Somewhere far away, in a tavern or a temple, someone would tell his story. They would speak of the White Wolf, the butcher of Blaviken, the slayer of beasts. They would make him larger than life, because men needed their heroes to be gods. But the truth was smaller and more beautiful. He had simply lived. He had chosen again and again to walk forward, even when the path led nowhere, and that, he thought, was enough. The last of the light touched his face, warm and fleeting. His breath slowed. The river below caught the glow of the sun and held it, trembling. The wind quieted. When the wolves sang again, their song was softer, almost a lullaby. The world kept turning. And in its silence, beneath the old oak and the endless sky, the White Wolf finally found his rest, not in death, not in legend, but in the quiet truth of a life lived fully, and a story that would never need to end. There are stories the world forgets, and stories the world refuses to let go. Some are written in ink, others in blood, and a few are carried only by the wind, whispered through the leaves, sung by rivers, remembered by wolves beneath the moon. The tale of the White Wolf is one such story. Time has passed since his footsteps last marked the path. The fields where he once fought are green again. The ruins where he once bled are covered in moss, softened by the patience of the years. The swords he carried have rusted to silence. The monsters he slew long turned to dust. And yet, somehow, his presence lingers, not as a man, not even as a ghost, but as a quiet pulse in the heart of the world. The villagers who live along the old road still speak of him when the nights grow long. By their hearths, they tell their children of the Witcher with eyes like amber, who walked through war and fire, but never lost his mercy. They say he could speak to beasts, that he could tell truth from lies with a glance, that he loved once, deeply, fiercely, and that it was that love, not his sword, that made him immortal. Some say he died by the river, beside an oak tree older than kings. Others say he still walks the mountains when the fog is thickest, his shadow moving between the trees, his footsteps light as ash. But those who have listened closely, those who dream deeply, know better. For men like Geralt of Rivia do not end. They simply return to the silence from which all stories come. The bards sing of him sometimes, though their voices are too soft to capture the truth. They sing of the monsters, the magic, the women and wars. But what they cannot sing, what no song can hold, is the quiet that defined him. The way he looked at the world not as something to conquer, but as something to understand. In the old tongue, there is a word for souls like his, gleaner. It means those who walk the in-between. Neither saint nor sinner, neither hero nor beast. Those who live in the space between light and shadow, and remind the world that both are needed. And perhaps that is why his story endures. Not because he was flawless, but because he was human, more so than those who called themselves kings. There is a field somewhere in the north where the wind never stops. It carries with it the scent of snow and pine, and beneath the soil lies nothing but the roots of old memories. If one were to walk there at dusk, when the sun bleeds into the horizon and the sky is caught between gold and grey, they might hear it, a faint rhythm, steady and low. the sound of hooves on distant ground, the echo of a song no bard remembers, but the land itself still hums. It is said that those who hear it find peace in their dreams that night. They wake with no fear, no anger, only the sense that somewhere far away, something vast and kind is still watching. Ciri, grown now beyond myth, still dreams of him. Sometimes she walks through a world that feels half familiar, where the stars burn white and endless, and she sees a figure standing at the edge of the horizon. He turns but never speaks. She does not need him to. The wind carries his words without sound. You are not alone. Yennefer, too, remains in the hearts of poets and dreamers. They say her laughter can still be heard in the wind that moves through Vengerberg's towers, soft and bittersweet. They say she never truly sought immortality. She simply refused to die where love still lived. And in that love, she remains, woven into every story told by those who believe that power and tenderness are not opposites, but reflections. Together, their names have become the refrain of an old song, a melody without beginning or end. It is sung not by the living, nor by the dead, but by the world itself. The snow that falls upon Kaer Morhen's broken stones, the rivers that remember every battle, the wolves that lift their voices beneath the moon. They sing of a man who walked with monsters and found his humanity among them. They sing of a woman who defied fate and found her heart again in the ashes. They sing of a child who carried the future in her blood and who learned that destiny was not a chain, but a path one chooses to walk. And when the song fades, when the last note drifts into silence, it leaves behind a truth so small, so gentle that even the gods might overlook it, that peace is not the absence of pain, but the grace of having lived through it. The world moves on. The ages turn. Kingdoms fall and rise again. But somewhere in the quiet places, in the hush before dawn, in the whisper of rain against stone, in the lonely roads where the wind hums like memory, the legend of the White Wolf still breathes, not as a story told to frighten or to praise, but as a reminder that even those forged for battle can find gentleness, that even those cursed to wander can find home, that even in a world of monsters, there are hearts that remain unbroken. And when the last fire dies and the stars take their watch, the night itself will remember, not the witcher's blade, not his hunts or his scars, but the man who carried silence with the dignity of a prayer, the one who walked between shadow and light and made both sacred, the one who, in the end, chose peace. And so the song of the White Wolf endures, not loud, not triumphant, but soft, endless, like the sound of the wind over the mountains, and the heartbeat of a world that at last forgave itself. Even those shaped by steel and sorrow still dream beneath the moon's soft glow. For destiny is not a chain, but a song, and every blade must learn to sing.